I'm sure everyone has been welcomed several times already, but welcome and good afternoon. I know we're getting super close to lunch, but hang in there with us for the next 30 minutes while we talk about the real MES team members of Pharma and what happens when the wheels fall off during your implementation. So most MES programs look green on a dashboard until real life hits. We all know things sound perfect in practice, but things happen. And it's really about what you do to pivot and correct those things. So before I jump in, quick show of hands. Who here has seen an MES deployment timeline shift for one reason or another? Whew. More than I was even expecting. Appreciate that. I'm glad we are all in the correct room. So in a world that's pushing hard towards digitization and AI, we want to talk about the team members that are on the floor making these systems work every single day and making them work with your factory. We happen to have 4 of those folks on the panel you see before you today. We have Mr. Kyle Schwarzenegger, Grant Wallace, Pat Cassidy, and Ton Nguyen. So in today's panel, we're going to talk about those wheels off moments, the pivot that we made to course correct, and leave you guys with something you can apply in the plant at some point when the situation arises. So I want to talk about where projects quietly drift. Design. So what happens in a plant when you have multiple different designers working on multiple different designs, all for a similar process?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common scenario. I think most organizations understand, some of the limitations of siloing, but we all tend to do it anyway. And that's especially attractive for MES design because it kind of opens up your design space. You don't have to consider what's happening in these other work streams. You can just do everything and make it fit for purpose. But that's part of the problem is by doing that, like everywhere is gonna have bin management typically. And if you have 5 designers, you could end up with 5 different ways to manage your bin. So you're kind of reinventing this wheel every time. So to try to get around that, you just need design standards.
Yeah, appreciate that, Pat. So it definitely sounds like we have lived this situation firsthand. So can you guys talk about a moment where you didn't have any design standards and you saw things start to unravel?
Yeah, an example I like to give is at a manufacturing facility we were recently at. They had a process with product with different formulations and multiple compression bays and multiple film coating bays. And we decided early on with the designers that the differences in the processes were enough that it warranted multiple designs. And so due to time constraints, we decided to split those designs up. And I noticed that 2 of the designers were working hand in hand and were coordinating a lot of their efforts together. And a 3rd designer was working very independent. And when the designs came back to me to do a dry run, which is where I basically run through the design, make sure it's executable, it makes sense, it matches the requirements of the paper records, the 2 I ran first were the 2 that were coordinating, and that became my baseline. When I ran through the 3rd design, it was fairly different than the other 2, not to say that it was wrong, it was just different. There were multiple or similar steps in completely different basic functions. There were state transitions that were happening in different locations and just kind of some overall misaligned verbiage. And so, flipping to an operator's perspective, if those designs were to have made it out onto the floor and they're running those different formulations in subsequent bays at the same time, it's going to become very confusing when they're going between those bays trying to understand the differences between these designs and if they're on purpose and what they mean. And it's also just going to be inefficient to the overall process. So having standardized designs is super important.
Definitely sounds like kind of a design nightmare.
Absolutely, yes.
So what did you guys do to fix the divergent designs and not impact the timeline?
So first, imagine every day you go into work, you have to work through 3 doors. Look identical, but one push, one pull, and one slide. Every time you approach them, you have to hesitate for a second. What do I do? Those seconds seem small, but in fast-paced production, it's add up. Same thing with operator. When they move from one area to another, when they rotate all the time, the same product, similar process, but suddenly the layout, the format, and the naming look different. They have to stop and think, is something wrong, or is this intentionally? And that's when we know that consistency matters. We can't stop production or slow down the project to fix it. So what we do, first, we don't force a massive standard to to fit all the processes. But we focus on the smaller, repeatable processes in the plant. So we use, reusable framework, naming convention, building template like module block that designer can start using immediately and adopt over time. So now when the designer approach a new process like building Lego, you don't start building from each brick, but you use what already been validated, logic proven, assembled together, adjust what need to be changed, and then go on. And it actually reduce work, prevent diversion, and speed up the project because the foundation is already there.
Heck yeah. Thanks for the analogies. The push, pull, and slide door is really appropriate for what the operators see every single day when designs are divergent. But what I'm hearing you say, Tan, is you need enough standardization to protect usability, but don't spend months and months creating the perfect standard before delivering value.
Yep, exactly. We're not chasing perfection, but we focus on things that operator doesn't have to think about when they execute a batch record.
Yep, cool. Yeah, and we see that design standards, not having them can be a really heavy lift, especially when you have to go back and retrain operators based on the preconceived notions they had from previous designs. Design sounds super simple. We all think, yes, we need that. But I think we heard some folks today talk about continuous improvement in design, and it's really important, and we see that a lot of sites just don't have those standards in place. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about what you do when you have those design standards and you move to the point of validation. So let's say that the site, the global team has all agreed on having some type of design standard. Your team is cruising through creating MBRs, and you get to the point of validation or verification. When does verification go from discipline to overkill?
Yeah, we see a lot of sites treat every one of their subsequent area deployments as an entire system validation, where they're repeatedly re-verifying standard system functionality for each area as they continuously, launch in different areas. That's where we believe that kind of design verification differs in you kind of two options. You can do it like I was just talking about, where you're completely treating it like it's from scratch every single time, or you can leverage existing design standards that you have built and point to previous test strategies that you've executed and leverage the things that you've already verified, which will allow you to focus more on the newer elements of your design so you can verify those when you know that in your back pocket you've got all these other standardized designs that have been verified.
Absolutely. Sounds like another lived experience for us.
Absolutely.
But when for you guys has verification as a concept not been as effective as it could have been?
Yeah, sure. Verification is not all blue skies, as you can imagine. What we've seen, and I think one of the earlier presentations alluded to this, is that it's ideal to start with a finalized design, and that way you have the ability to risk assess throughout that process. But in some of the environments that we've worked in, the goal is to really do an agile approach, and as those requirements are discovered and logged, designs change, risk assessments need to be updated, and it becomes an iterative documentation effort. And so it can't always be as fast-paced and straightforward as you'd like, but if you focus on the risk and have robust documentation, you can move through that challenge.
Got it. So yeah, with all those different variables, what is it that brings clarity back, and how do you strike a balance between exhaustive validation and true risk-based verification?
Yeah, and risk-based is the key word. We work in regulated industries. Like the Vertex presentation said, the FDA wants you to do risk-based validation. ISPE wants you to do risk-based validation. That's kind of the name of the game now. And the good thing is you're implementing these systems. Typically, that's on a validated process. And if they're doing risk-based validation for that, they have all kinds of validation documents you can piggyback onto. There should already be your technical risk assessments and product control strategies, FRAs, like they said, failure mode effects analyses. You can use those to figure out what to focus on for your validation strategy. The other thing that I think is really key when you're developing your test cases is just, like some other people have said, involve your SMEs, involve your people on the floor. They know what they have to deal with. They know the common scenarios, if it's daily, weekly, monthly. If you look at a batch record, they almost never go according to plan. There are always things that come up, and your SMEs are going to be the ones that help you catch those ahead of time.
Yeah. So it definitely sounds like end users are extremely important, and really when it comes to design verification, you need to work with the operators on the floor and really verify the things that they're likely to see and use every single day in their process.
Exactly.
Right on. So yeah, and of course, like we talked about, end users are extremely important, and identifying those risks and those variables early on in the process is of utmost importance. And the way that you're able to identify those things is through effective business change management. And speaking of business change management, how convenient. It's really important to note that things are not always as they seem on paper, and are not always MES ready. There's a lot of things that happen in the background that process-wise might not be super clear in your SOPs or your batch records. And so we just talked about verifying design and process is essential, but how do we identify these things early on in the process and what those assumptions are in the process?
Assumptions. We don't take any assumptions, right? Yeah. And I think one of the things that I think is a primary assumption is that, production leadership, quality leadership, they think that because we're already releasing product that the current records are sufficient. And that's not a dig at paper, it's just the current parameters that you're operating under. But once you start looking to make MES accountable for all the process steps, you find that you've got either gaps or ways of work that are being the human bridge between the SOP, the form, the record, and et cetera. So that's really what we like to try to focus on, is focusing on, we've got really great records, we're comparing those, we're getting that process for transformation, but where are the steps that are going to be essential for us to find so that we don't get to a defect or an exception there during that process?
Got it. So you talk about some of those defects and identification. Have you guys seen a time where you moved into an implementation and leadership thought all of the processes were super clear, but MES implementation exposed that that wasn't the case?
Yeah, absolutely. So at a packaging facility we were recently implementing at, the managers obviously wanted us to put all the equipment in, track its usage, and track the campaign rules. And we did our normal thing of implementing all the equipment. But I went out to the floor to talk to the operators, as I found is very important. And I asked them kind of a crazy question. I said, what is something odd that happens and is not part of a normal scenario, or something that you have to document and kind of tell a story of what happened? And, typically the response is usually like, where do I begin, or where do I start, or how much time do you have? In this situation, they said, well, our pneumatic transfer system, which they were using to transfer soft gels from a floor hopper into a blister machine, they said, sometimes we don't even use the PTS at all. We'll just directly hand dump right into the blister machine if the PTS isn't available. And they said, and sometimes we will start off by using the pneumatic transfer system, and we find debris or something happens, we have to send it away to be cleaned, so then we'll start hand dumping at any spot within the batch. And then alternatively, there's another situation where they will start off by hand dumping, and then the PTS becomes available, and then they start using it at the end of the batch. So all that to say, I brought that all back to the designers, was talking to them about it, and we were looking in the procedures and the tickets, and none of this stuff was mentioned. It's all just things that are in operators' heads that they know because they know how to keep the process running, and they know that the end game is efficiency. And so talking to the operators is very important.
I think we can all agree that sounds like a very typical manufacturing facility. A lot of unspoken processes that happen.
Yep.
So what did you guys do to get that unstuck and get the project moving forward again?
Yeah, well, one thing we like to do, I feel like we all try to look for technical controls first, but what we like to use is maybe taking a different approach, using what we call the steering committee, or SteerCo for short. It's getting your leadership team involved, because sometimes when you look at your actual business processes, they aren't that good or they're not consistent, and so sometimes you need to change those processes to meet system capability, and that's really what SteerCo is for. And there are also number of other benefits. Once you get your leadership team involved, that lets them take more ownership of the system. It lets them say, hey, this is my system, we made these decisions because of these reasons, instead of saying, hey, why did you do this to our business process rules or whatever.
Yeah. So you talk about SteerCo a little bit and having enough cooks in the kitchen. So leading the witness a little bit, are you saying that this type of an implementation is not just an operations or an IT-led initiative?
Yeah, that's, I think, something that's easy to do, so you want to try to do that, but ultimately to change the business, you have to get all aspects of the business involved.
Yep, no doubt. Yeah, we often find that there's a misalignment among the leadership teams, and so end user involvement with that management team is critical for successful implementation. When that happens, it becomes a system that the end users were involved in and adopt, and so it's something they're proud of at the end of the day, and they're much less likely to throw stones at it once it's deployed. Business change is not something that just happens. It's really adopted through gaining trust from all of your end users. And so, of course, with any new system, especially one as large as this type of an implementation that touches so many areas, training is extremely important. I think I've heard a couple different people talk about training today. So why is it that this very important thing, training, typically gets crammed into the last 10% of a deployment timeline?
Well, for any project, not just MES project, we have to do the project why. The line keep running, right? Because product need to be made, order need to be shipped, schedule always tight. So that's why training often get pushed to the last 10%, if we're lucky, sometimes 5%. So the project team start building, configuring, testing the system to protect the production when they're running the line. And then at the end, right before go live, we put everybody into a classroom, reading SOP, listen to presentation, watching video, and that's where the risk start. None of us here know how to learn how to ride a car in a classroom, right? There's a difference between process training and system training. I remember one operator told us that they know how to use the software, but they're just not sure if it matches what they're doing on the production floor. And it's kind of click. The gap here is not about the software knowledge, it's about the workflow understanding. So a lot of the previous presentation that stated that the most effective training is when we involve end user early and throughout the project. So just quick introduction, small workflow checkup, dry run, parallel run, small touch point that don't disrupt production, but building understand early. That help a lot. A learner permit doesn't make you a driver.
For sure. Yeah, that sounds like an ideal state for rolling out the training program. But what's a situation you guys have seen where everything looked perfectly fine in the classroom, you took your driver test, but then it totally failed when it got to the shop floor?
Yeah, on one of our more recent deployments, we tried to circumvent, I think everybody's had to deal with these like Schrodinger's operators where their time is both cheap but too expensive for training at the same time. So to get around that, we decided to just train the leads and rely on them to cascade the training. Of course, cascading the training didn't happen until go live week. So suddenly you have what's effectively a UI change for your batch record and all your operators are trying to learn on the fly. Meanwhile, your area lead is running around with their hair on fire, trying to hold as many hands as possible. And unfortunately, that isn't a really good way to transfer knowledge. You're doing a lot of hand holding. You're not really teaching them to fish. You're just kind of running around handing them out. So It took, I would say, probably weeks in this case for the operators to truly be independent system operators.
Got it. So what does effective transition support actually look like?
Yeah, so even before you transition, like we talked about, it's very easy to just have a bunch of operators in a room, run them through what the designs look like, and say, we're going live on Monday. One of the things that I think is very helpful, in my opinion, is you might have heard Ton say a parallel run. And we've used that term to go out onto the floor with the operators, have them run a batch record as they normally would on paper, and then in parallel, run it in a sandbox environment using your designs so that there's a couple of benefits you get from that. One of them is the operators get used to the system, they train with the system, they start to get their feet wet a little bit, and then you also get to see if there's any gaps in the designs that you have built and allows you to implement their feedback before you actually are live on the floor with the operators or with the designs. For post-transition support, we like to utilize a 2 to 3 week ELS or early life support period where I'm boots on the ground with the operators, showing them kind of tips and tricks, best way to use the designs, best ways to kind of go about executing different elements of the designs, and just kind of overall training. And then in the second week, you can start to kind of fade out the support, and rather than giving direct answers to some of the operators' questions, you start to kind of teach them and ask them, what do you think is next, or what do you think is the best option to do in the situation? That's also a critical time to loop in the area managers, have them come over, because the operators are going to have to also rely on the area managers to answer some of their questions. And so it's very easy to get into the trap of operators relying on the MES team while they're deploying in other areas. So getting the area managers up to speed on all of that is very important as well.
Definitely. So yeah, don't confuse awareness with capability, and it sounds like just pushing buttons on a screen is not the same as confidently running a badge.
Yep, absolutely. Like Ton said, you don't learn to drive a car in a classroom.
For sure. So yeah, Kyle already alluded to it, but with training, it's really important to have that sandbox environment so that you can get a lot of the practice and then really lean into that early life support period with your operations team so they can adopt it and use the system every day. And with that, we really appreciate everyone's time sitting in the room listening to us while your bellies are probably hungry. And we appreciate the candid discussion from our panel here. We can confidently say that when projects do go off track, it rarely starts with the software or the system. It's really a misalignment in design, verification, business assumptions, and the people. And these are all hard-won lessons from the team sitting on this panel that live these scenarios every single day at a client site. The teams that are willing to pause, realign, and involve the people on the floor are the ones that successfully pivot. So I think we've got like 30 seconds for questions. Appreciate everybody's time.
Hi. So I'm curious if you faced this scenario. As you know, we're in the middle of doing transform solutions, but at the same time, sites are focused on doing MES upgrades. So we've taken the stance we don't want to add like a new transform solution at the same time we're migrating because it may be too much, for a site to absorb. So I'm just curious, have you run into that as well in your implementations, and how have you handled that or advised your clients?
Yes.
I think I took your microphone.
Yeah, it's okay. We're problem solving here. So yeah, we've run into that. What we like to do is have some stability going into an upgrade. We did one in 2023 for a version of PASIX, and so we paused. And I think that's one of the challenging parts is you want there to be the continuity and the stability, but you also want to keep deploying. And so in our experience, it's easier to just pause, call it very clearly, this is the beginning of an upgrade, this is when we're going to cut over, and then move through. But we also, don't stop, because what we've also done is the lower environments, 3-environment setup, the lower environments usually get the upgrades earlier. So as you get those systems stood up, you can move back into the project mode and start building and qualifying in that lower environment, then do that full push in production. So we try to take a bit of a hybrid approach, but really for the production focus, we're kind of call a period of stability. We try to keep it really tight, though. You don't want a long ramp down, ramp up period. But does that answer your question? Yeah.
Any other questions? All right. Hello. So you mentioned about how important training is, especially at the beginning of the onset. What have been your experiences with records that have been deployed for a few years and you're constantly bringing in new staff? Have you been able to crack that nut on training up the new folks, or is it just the initial deployment training that you have set up in place?
Yeah, we have ran into that before. We've had where new operators come in and they like to see how the system works. A lot of times a lot of sites are in the middle of transitioning to MES, so a lot of new operators aren't familiar at any MES, and so taking the time to run through some of the designs with the operators. We've also had them shadow some area leads, and a lot of times what they do on paper is they will have the trainee sign for steps, and then they'll have someone make a comment on the paper record for each of those steps. And so, we've advised that they can do the same thing in PASSEX or MES without having access. They can just create exceptions or comments on some of those steps to say, like, throughout this time period, this trainee was assisting with these activities. So you can go both either the classroom route or just, live on the floor with an area lead.
Thanks.
The other thing I think, Kyle, you really caught it early on is having demo records. I think having records that mimic the floor processes but aren't necessarily so exhaustive. If you might have 4 iterations of something, you might cut it down to 1, but you get them comfortable with a sandbox environment where you let them kind of bounce around in the system without having to be like, okay, well now you only had that classroom training for driving, go out there and get on the highway. I think we give them the ability to drive around in a parking lot a little bit and use that lower environment as the training environment, and they're kind of constructed on purpose for training, not just as a development workflow. So helps get them comfortable, and also helps the designers get more input of like, hey, it would be really helpful to have a notice or a step or something here.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, GMP Pros. I keep wanting to say GMP Bros and really trying not to do that. And I had to get that in there.
We say that sometimes internally.